Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri, your instructor for this course. And today we're going to start module what? Module 7. And if you recall, in module 7, we cover two chapters. We cover chapters 15 and what? Chapter 17. Chapter 15 that I'm going to cover right now is going to focus on United Nations. And then after that, with the next video, I cover chapter 17 for you. But let's start with chapter 15. As you know, the topic of chapter 15 is United Nations. I tried to put as much information as possible, summarizing, because if you remember, the chapter was a little bit on the long side too. All right, I tried to summarize some of the main point in my PowerPoint for you, and I tried to jazz it up by including also some other, images which I think are very helpful. So what I'm going to do is for these, almost 20 slides, I'm going to start first by kind of reminding you about the learning objectives and the summaries of this, and then we are going to move on to each one of the chapters. So starting with the learning objectives for this particular chapter, you need to remember two things. First of all, the summary of the contents. In that regard, first we cover the United Nations and its evolution, or what some people call its history. Is that right? Then we cover the United Nations Charter. Charter is like a word used for what we would call sometimes constitution. Is that right? The main treaty. Then we cover United Nations Security Council, and then after that we cover the UN and the whole notion of global governance. And then last but not least, we cover what? Reforming the UN. So after, obviously covering these things, what should you remember after reading the chapter and listening to this lecture? Well, you should remember that United Nations structure and the processes. You should also be able to address what the UN seeks to achieve. All right. Also, you need to know the UN's role in emerging global governance in the 21st century. That's very important. The difficulties of the reforming the UN is the next topic that you should at least recall. And last but not least, something about the UN successes and, of course, its failure. All right. No organization is perfect. All right. Having said that one, now let's start with what is the UN. And here I have two slides for you. The first slide basically suggests that UN is an IGO. We already covered some of this material, so I just go over it kind of quickly. IGO is, as you know, intergovernmental organization. Okay, so means that only states or governments, they can be a member of an IGO, because it says intergovernmental. It doesn't say international, because sometimes when the term nation comes over there, and we're going to talk about some of the other organizations. If you remember, actually I mentioned some of them in the previous lectures. That, for example, INGO stands for International Non-Governmental Organization. Cases like that, like Greenpeace. Is that right? Any of you can become a member of Greenpeace, but you guys, being a U.S. citizen and also the students that we have representing different countries, they cannot say over there, I would like to be a member of the UN. You can't. Why? Because the people that are going to be representing the U.S. at the UN and other IGOs are people who are coming from our State Department and in their countries, foreign ministry. Is that right? So it's a different one because it's a very formal organization. Okay, so there are many, of course, IGOs. As you know, your book is really covering all of those. And their numbers have been increasing. And why? Is because the expectation from them has increased, and because we expect them to do a lot of different type of things for us. Okay, not just peace and security, but development, human rights, this, that, environmental issues, trade, you name it. We will talk about these things even more. So we can say that states, they join an IGO for two major purposes. One is to cooperate with one another, and the other one is also to enhance their own national interest, which that whole notion of national interest, remember, was coming from what? Realist perspective. Is that right? That, the states are, these entities that they want to only protect themselves. States are the only, actors that we should consider and everything. So as you can see, even to address the concerns of the realists, you would say that, well, that's one of the reasons for, states to join an IGO. Okay, so when a state joins an IGO, of course, because the IGO has a charter, is that right, or a constitution, it has some rules, so it cannot violate those rules, or better to say, it should not. That's that's the main point that we are making. And those rules are in the charter or the constitution of that particular what organization. All right. Having said that one, now let's say a few words about the UN and its evolution, in that regard. Of course, as you probably know, UN was established right after World War II. The charter and some of the other original ideas were the works of, our former, President FDR, and in association with what Prime Minister Churchill was thinking about. They were thinking about some kind of like a, North Atlantic, ideas that would include, and it would be a better and more improved version of like League of Nations. Okay, so you might say, well, why that? Well, the United Nations basically followed, after World War II, the task that League of Nations started. Because if you recall, League of Nations was established in 1920, right after World War I finished, because League of Nations, very frankly, did the best it could with that limited authority that was given to it. But as you probably know, League had a lot of problems. First of all, some of the major countries that never became a member, one of it being U.S., is that right? U.S. was one of the founding, I wouldn't say member because it never became a member, but, one of the main elements contributing to the establishment of it, but it didn't become a member. And then some others that they became a member, they were competing with each other so much, and they were trying to ignore things, and they did whatever they could against the rules of the organization, and eventually the organization became, basically ineffective. Is that right? If the major countries, members of it, they completely ignore the rules, what do you expect? Is that right? You can't expect success. So in that regard, we can say that it was very important for League of Nations after World War I to bring awareness. That's basically a task that UN has also tried to follow. So the whole notion of awareness of global issues is very important. The other thing is to try to indicate that the extreme form of behavior, in form of like, when, in terms of the governance, if you're talking about extreme form of violence, is not acceptable. Is that right? During World War II, for example, a lot of people, they were using chemical weapons, things like that. Is that right? They wanted to come up with standards that even during the war, there are certain things that are so horrible that you should not use. Okay, so Lee contributed to establishing those standards. And then last but not least, we can say, it tried to outlaw some of the, activities of, nations that could lead into, again, another major crisis. In that regard, it was trying to show them that there should be a sense of interdependence, there should be some kind of interconnection. And by states feeling like their, future is interconnected, very frankly, they would not rock the boat. Is that right? They would follow the rules. Okay. The next thing that we need to cover in the second slide associated with this, like what are the aims of the UN? The UN is basically began as a what? Not an IGO that does one thing, but an IGO that has multiple tasks. Is that right? Or what we call multi-purpose IGO. So we usually think about the term UN in association with, let's prevent war, let's promote peace, but UN does more than that. And I'm going to cover that one when I cover the three P's in that regard. So how does UN is trying to protect peace and prevent war? By focusing on the general concept of collective security. So write it down. Make sure that you remember that one. Is that right? Collective security, which basically a collective security organization is an organization that as members has all the members of international community. Is that right? And it's basically an alliance or a coalition of all of these states against any one other state from within that community that would threaten the peace. Is that right? So if all countries in the world are members of it, and then one of them decides, instead of negotiation and diplomacy, is going to attack its neighbor, is that right? Even if the country is a very, very powerful country, supposedly, according to the idea of collective security, everybody else, backs up the victim, and then their combined power would deter what? The aggressor. That's the idea. Now, I said that's the idea. That's the theory. It doesn't mean all the theories are going to end up being what? Exactly the practice. In practice, it has become sometimes very complicated because the country that is aggressive usually has allies. Okay, and those allies are not going to say, yeah, let's go against this particular state, because they're thinking about, okay, I'm helping these guys, and then maybe when I'm in trouble, they can help me, they can support me. That's one thing. You see what I mean? So there are a lot of other conditions involved, but at least in theory, that's the whole idea about collective security. And this was an idea not first for UN, but this was the idea that actually established also League of Nations. All right. One of the other things that you need to consider about the United Nations is this, that of course the main audience of United Nations was supposed to be, and the members were supposed to be states. Is that right? Guess what? One of the things they discovered is, yes, states, we can call states that are attacking and this and that, but sometimes it's the leader of a particular state that initiates all that trouble. Is that right? Like look at, for example, World War II. Who initiated all the aggression and everything? It was Adolf Hitler. Is that right? We can just black market and say, oh, it was Germany. Yes. Well, I mean, Adolf Hitler, when we came to the power and eventually, and gave a lot of promises to people, you know, populist leaders. As I mentioned once before, you need to watch out for populist leaders. Is that right? Because they use their connection, they're usually charismatic, etc., etc. They usually use their connection to the people to get into the power, but they have their own ambition. You know, there are things that they want to do. I'm not suggesting that everything they do is wrong, you know, because we have populist leaders in our own country too. There are populist leaders in other parts of the world as well. Right now, Hungary is under a populist leader. Is that right? Many people, they suggested that when President Trump was our president, he's a populist leader. Is that right? So, I mean, these are the type of people that you would see. And as you know, for example, Brazil under the previous president was a populist leader. So there are populist leaders not in one part of the world. They are actually all over, but their behavior has a tendency to be kind of similar in terms of they use their connections with the people to kind of, you know, try to outdo the usually institutions that they would control their power, and then they become, you know, a force to be reckoned with. So those are some of the things that I wanted to mention. So in that regard, getting to that point of the UN is trying to keep not just states responsible, but also individuals, because it would be the individuals that could be, you know, starting something that would end up in a major crisis. Okay. Now, what about, again, continuing with this whole notion of the aims of the UN and connection that it has to international law? The connection to international law is, guys, it's very simple. UN is based on the UN Charter. UN Charter is an international treaty. Is that right? It's an international treaty that originally, you know, the original members of the international community signed it. Is that right? Guess what? An international treaty is an international law. If, you know, and we're going to cover those things, you know, in the next chapter. So in that regard, we can say that United Nations activities that is associated with international law has come out into many different sources. Is that right? Like, for example, what? Like the charters of the Nuremberg and the Tokyo War Crime Tribunals. Here we go. That's one source. Next one. Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Next one. International Convention on Civil and you know, Political Rights in 1966. Another international law. And last but not least, European Convention on Human Rights, which was signed in 1950. So I want you to see how, interesting enough, these two topics of international organization and international law interconnected. Why do you think we are covering them both in the same module? Okay? All right. Another important notion, going to the next slide, is talking about when we say UN is a general what? IGO. Well, it's a general IGO because UN also has some specialized agencies. And I'm going to go over a number of them here, introducing them to you, and then say a little bit about what they do. Some of them I'm sure you've heard of, okay? One of them that is very famous, everybody talks about it, is World Bank, okay? World Bank actually is a term we use for something called IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, okay? Not too many people, they say International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They just say World Bank, okay? Now, what does World Bank do? The job of World Bank, guys, is to lend money, okay, and promote economic development projects. So let's say you want to build a dam, you know, like for example, the Egyptians, you know, wanted to build a dam on, you know, the Aswan Dam, is that right? Over the initial areas of, you know, Nile River. Why? To control the flow of water, to get electricity, to do this, to do that, etc., etc. When it comes to something like that, big projects like that in many of these developing countries, okay, guess what? They usually go to World Bank. They request funds from there, and then World Bank sends its experts, and they talk and this and that, and they talk about a lot of the financial aspect and details and everything else. And you know, when it's approved, they lend them money. Okay. Another one is UN, what they call ECOSOC, United Nations Council. You know, United Nations Economic and Social Council. Okay, United Nations Economic and Social Council is the organ of the UN that actually produces a lot of what? Material associated with economic development. Because we usually think about UN, as I mentioned earlier, we think about their war and peace activities, all right? They try to bring peace and they try to prevent war. But actually, believe it or not, about 75% of the UN budget is spent on economic development. Okay, and you know, UN ECOSOC, as I mentioned in that, you know, hopefully you have the PowerPoint open, is that right? On slide number 8, you would see it over there. Another specialized agency is, you know, IMF. Now, I mentioned ECOSOC right here as an, you know, as a, you know, organ of the UN that is doing that, but technically, you know, UN ECOSOC is an organ of the UN. It's within the, you know, it's not one of the specialized agencies. The specialized agencies so far were World Bank, IMF, you know, WC, FAO, and WHO. And I'm going to mention each one of those. So as I mentioned, IMF is another one. IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. This is also an organization within the UN that lends money, but it lends money for completely different purposes, okay? It doesn't lend money for development issues. It lends money for what? It lends money for balance of payment. So a country has a balance of payment issues, all right? They're spending more and, you know, as opposed to earning more, or the trade is, you know, they're, you know, buying more as opposed to selling more. So there is that imbalance. So again, they send their people, they can lend you what? Short-term loans. So that's one of the major differences between, by the way, between IMF and World Bank. They both lend money, but World Bank, you know, loans are usually at least mid, you know, to long-term loans. IMF loans are usually short-term to maximum mid-term loans, but are mostly short-term. Okay. The next organization is International Whaling, you know, Commission. What do you expect? This is the organization that has been helping to prevent the, you know, the disappearance of the whales around the world. Is that right? Because there was a time that there were thousands of whales in this planet, and then suddenly with certain countries arguing that, you know, based on their tradition, countries like Norway and Japan, suggesting that they needed that for whatever purposes, cultural purposes, you know, food, this, that, rations, etc., etc. They almost disappeared. And so this organization gave it a sense of order. And I'm very pleased to report that with more awareness of international public all over the world, the number of whales, you know, certain species more than others, has started gradually increasing. So that's a good news. All right. So they're hopefully not going to disappear the way they were going to. Next one is Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO. I actually know a little bit about this one more than others because my dad used to work there, you know. And that's why we were traveling. My dad used to call us professional gypsies because they were moving us from one country to another. Anyway, so Food and Agriculture Organization obviously deals with what? Food and, agriculture issues. My dad was, by profession, he was an agriculture, he was a professor of agriculture, engineering, but his area of specialization was, basic irrigation, and his particular area was irrigation in arid and semi-arid land, which basically translates into what? Desert. So our family, we have visited any country that has any kind of desert, all the way from Australia to, as you know, in South Pacific, to Gobi Desert of China, to Rajasthan Desert of what? India, to of course all the Middle East, North Africa, and all the Middle Eastern countries. Each one of them, they have at least one or two deserts. Is that right? So all over the world, and including some parts in Latin America that is becoming more desert-like. Some areas of Amazon, river in Brazil that they were doing what we call clear cutting. Is that right? And the rain would come and wash off all the topsoil. Guess what? Then after that, nothing would grow, and deserts started growing. So you need to consider those. Last but not least is WHO. I'm sure some of you have heard of that one, because during the COVID, WHO was coming with all those standards, trying to make sure that they can somehow bring a sense of order to all those different policies of all the member states. Why? Because they wanted to make sure to somehow control this disease. Not, if you remember, millions of people died around the world, so they were trying to protect that. All right, so beyond the specialized agencies and that one particular organ, what else can we say? We can say that the growth of these universal agencies reflects two major developments. One of it is obviously the notion of collective security when it deals with peace and security. The other one deals with the whole notion of the scope of international law is increasing, and it's including a lot of other things. Like what? Like human rights, like development, like environment. That's why all those other issues are coming about. Is that right? Okay. Now we go to slide number 10. And slide number 10 is focusing on the UN what? Charter. Okay. So the UN Charter, as I mentioned, is a model that, is based on the, international law. And it talks about accountability. Is that right? So usually, just like, U.S. Constitution. In U.S. Constitution, what do we have? We have two types of things. One aspect of it is the rights of U.S. citizens. And the other part of it is the responsibilities of the U.S. citizens. Guess what? International sin is the same thing. The rights of states as opposed to their responsibilities. So that's important to remember. And in the post, 1945, international environment became more conducive into cooperation. Okay? And I know that usually the conflicts and wars, they capture the headlines. Yes, that's usually the case. Is that right? But really on everyday basis, states, they need one another, because for anything they wanted to do, they need cooperation. They want to, for example, cooperate. They want to deal with, let's say, an environmental problem associated with a river. Okay, well, the source of the river is in one country, the end of it is in another country, or sometimes it's in the border area like Rio Grande, is that right, between U.S. and Mexico, or sometimes, remember this past summer, we had all these fires, is that right, and we are talking about the summer of 2023, and some of it still, unfortunately, continues, in where? In Canada, okay? So what happened? Canadians were doing their best to control the, a fire, and then U.S. started sending what? Sending some help as well. Why? Because if you recall during the news, the fog from that one was covering, New England area, including what? New York City. So, so as you can see, even the most powerful states in the world, they need each other. All right. What else can we say in terms of the UN Charter? We can say that, of course, UN Charter promotes the whole notion of national self-determination. Is that right? Because that was one of the problems that even League of Nations discovered. Later on that, the reason there was this war was because certain groups, they felt like, their rights are not protected, they're fighting for their rights, they lead into terrorist activities, kill somebody else gets upset, they start declaring war, then the allies of that country come to their help, then the allies of the victims come to, you see what I mean? That's how things get started. It doesn't just start like one day everybody says, let's start fighting, is that right? So it's usually a small issue that unfortunately expands beyond the control. All right. So in that regard, one of the major organs of the UN is General Assembly. Is that right? So we have the Security Council so far that we introduced, and Security Council deals with what? And we're going to talk about it a little bit more later. It's dealing with what? War and peace issues. And then there's the UN General Assembly, which is basically like an international parliament. In the UN General Security, in the UN General Assembly, basically it's like the word parliament, and every country has one vote. Now, in Security Council is different, and we're going to talk about that one in a few minutes. So in the post-1945 world, we see that, they try to maintain the balance of power among the great powers, because usually the assumption in international relation is the countries with the power are the one that have to watch out, because they are the one that can cause trouble or move and shake and things like that. So there were somehow there were certain privileges which was included for them in the charter. And where was that privilege? In Security Council. So now it's the time to talk about it. Okay. So Security Council does not represent all of the countries in the world. It has 5 permanent members. What are the 5 permanent members? US, UK, France. Well, when it was established was Soviet Union, and now it's what? Russian Federation. And when it was established was China. Actually, originally they had given the seat of China to nationalist government, which is what we call now Taiwan. But in 1971, after Nixon administration had a rapprochement with, basically Red China, is that right, or People's Republic, that seat was taken away from Taiwan and given to what? To China, to PRC, People's Republic of China, because it was representing more than 1 billion people. Is that right? So that's very important. All right. So then, in addition to those, 5 permanent members that no matter what, they're going to be always there. Is that right? Then they have 10, non-permanent members. They're chosen, based on, a term limit and everything. And from time to time, these non-permanent members, it includes actually some of the other powerful countries, and some, obviously a number of developing countries. But nowadays, and we're going to talk about this one, is sometimes people, they think about maybe Security Council does not represent, the current, really international environments. Okay, so originally that balance was again between those countries I told you, U.S., Britain and France against the so-called communist countries. Now, the next notion, and here we are on, slide number 13, is the UN and the global governance. And what is the whole notion of global governance? Because global problems require universal efforts to resolve it. You remember what I told you about that just simple, environmental issue between US and Canada? Is that right? Canada cannot resolve it. And Canada is not a weak state. Canada is a very powerful state. Is that right? But still could not resolve it, so US. And then there are times that US needs help, and so others they help. So in this case, it's important that we cannot sometimes leave the work of international activity to one state, because those states, they need other states, and also they need sometimes non-state actors and IGOs to help them. Okay, associated with that on slide number 14, you see that we talk about global public policy network. And that's very important, because to deal with certain issues, let's say environment, let's say, for example, development, let's say protection of the rights of minorities, many times states, they need to make alliance with IGOs, is that right? With INGOs, with some local people here and there. They all work together like a network to what? To support one particular cause. So that's very important. So in that regard, we can say that in terms of global public policy network, UN is a very important player. Okay, so what about the non-governmental organization and the global governance at the UN? Here we go, slide number 15, is that right? As we mentioned, and your text, they did that one, and I know that they're trying to be as accurate as possible, but over 28 years of teaching, I noticed that confuses my student. So I came up with a shorter list. Is that right? If you look at, for example, your text says that according to the charter, the UN has, and I'm going to read it to you because you would see how long the list is. Okay, UN has core goals of improve peace and security, human rights, equality, justice, international laws, social progress, better standard of life, and economic and social advancement of all people. Okay. Yeah, it just gives it's like a jazz, it's like music, is that right? It covers all these things. But many of these can be summarized into 3 goals. To make sure that my students remember it, we call it the 3 Ps. The first P is peace, is that right? With peace comes security, so peace and security. The second one, we can borrow the word of Thomas Jefferson, that our founding father, who used to talk about prosperity. What 250 years ago they used to call prosperity, then now their term for it is economic development. Okay, so that's job number 2 of UN, and that's why so much of his budget is spent like that. And last but not least is protection of human rights. So what are the 3 Ps? So if there is a question about that one, I want you to remember the 3 Ps. Is that right? You could make a nice short answer or essay, or even sometimes here and there a multiple choice. So P number one, peace. And don't forget prosperity, peace and security. 2, prosperity, and next to that put economic development. 3, promotion of human rights. The 3 P's. Okay, having covered that one now, then we would talk about also the role of NGOs, is that right? So while there are maybe hundreds of, IGOs, there are thousands of INGOs, is that right? Or what some people call NGOs or something. And those are all to be what? Playing a supportive role, with the UN, with its what? With activities. Now, the next topic is reforms of the UN. And I know that topic could be confusing some people as well, and I'm sorry, but here we go. Let's go over some of it. Pretty much from the beginning, as soon as the UN came into existence, they started saying, you know what, this thing that UN does could do it that way better if we reform it, or that thing it does. So there has always been a conversation about reforming the UN, and we're not suggesting UN is perfect. Okay, let's face it, nobody is. But some of these reforms, they have taken more like an urgency as opposed to the others. And in recent years, we can say that the governments and some non-governmentals have been trying to say that we should really reorganize the UN because if by doing that one, it can function a little bit better. Okay, so what are some of these key issues? Well, there are a lot of key issues, from the peace aspect to prosperity or economic development to promotion of human rights, but there is no quick fixes, okay? There is no one solution we can say, oh, if they just do that, everything is going to be what? Peachy keen. No, anything you do, there's going to be a side effect. Is that right? And the question is, how is that going to affect either the great powers or the little powers, and would you make everybody happy? So that's one of the other notions associated with that. And in fact, you remember your text was talking about the whole notion of even if you bring some kind of change or something, would the great powers be happy? Because they are interested in self-love. Because first of all, they want to protect their own interests. At the same time, they want it to be loved by everybody else, or image or something. So I want you to remember that part. That part is described so well in the text that I'm not going to go and repeat whatever it says, because I think they have done a pretty good job. The bottom line is reforms, in some ways, they would be inevitable. Is that right? They're going to be required to do it in terms of, operation of what? Operation of the UN. So one of these major, reform has been suggested by a number of different states is really the composition of Security Council. They say, look, if the Security Council needs to really perform its job of protecting the peace, how come those 5, great powers, that they were great powers during, after World War II, they still can, what they say, no to some proposal, and then no of their proposal would be considered veto power. That's what they call it. So if, let's say, the 15, members of the council are getting together and they come up with some ideas, is that right? And then one of the 15 says, which is the permanent member, not the regular, non-permanent member, say, no, I don't like this, or I forbid this. The word for forbid in Greek is what? Veto power. So they veto it, and then that way they make Security Council to be paralyzed. Security Council cannot do anything if one of the permanent members does. And then another issue is, so some people, they say you should take the veto power completely out. Some people say, no, you should give more veto power to other states. Some people say, look at the composition of the great power. Why is UK and France there when, for example, a country like Japan and Germany, they have much bigger economy and everything else, and they can actually shake and move and things a lot more than UK and France. UK and France, during that time, they were still the leftover of the French Empire and the British Empire, and you see, they had a whole lot of power. But nowadays, they're not as powerful as, let's face it, Germany and Japan. So some people say you need to add that. Some people say, no, maybe we should also have some permanent members among the bigger countries in the global south or developing countries. Like what? Like India, like Brazil, like Nigeria. Look at, for example, India. India, this past summer in 2023, India's population became number one in the world in terms of what? In terms of the total population. As you know, we have always thought China was the most populous country in the world. India was the second one. Is that right? Well, guess what? This summer, India surpassed what? China. So it's right now the second, the most populous country in the world. So why? And then, so that means there are like at it's 1.3 or 1.4, depending on how you count it or something, billion Indians in the world. So we should ignore that and just focus on Great Britain that has only 55 million, or France that has even less population. You see what I mean? So those were some of the consideration. Or for example, forget about India with 120 million people, or 140 right now, depending again how to count it and things like that. Or Nigeria, in Africa. So these are all, or Brazil. So these are all some of the consideration in that regard. And then another notion associated with the reform was about finances. Look. As you know, those of you who are in some student clubs and organizations, you know that no organization can accomplish anything without what? Cashola, or money. Okay, so our expectation of the UN has increased, like, oh, help with this disaster, help with that disaster, do this. Well, they cannot print money, is that right? So where is that money supposed to come from? Well, that money is usually the money of the membership that are supposed to pay to UN. And some members of the UN, sometimes they try to put pressure on the UN, including US, including some of the other good guys. Is that right? By not paying their membership fee. So where are they going to get the money to do that? To buy blankets and this and that, and there is a disaster, there's a flood, there's an earthquake, there's this, there's that, to help. You see what I mean? So some people have suggested that the finances of the UN should be reformed. Some people suggested that, or maybe there should be an international tax, on certain type of trades or something, that the UN gets its funding that way, and then they can use this funding to help everybody. Because it's not like, oh, we're going to be increasing the salary of the Secretary General. No, they just wanted to have money to help people. Okay. Let's talk about the very last right now, slide. We got to the last one. We got to 20 right now, because last one was 19. Here, the whole notion that UN has done things that it's proud of. Is that right? But US has also done things that has been criticized, And the criticism of the UN, let's be fair. Some of it has something to do with no organization is perfect, and it does make some mistakes. But some of it really falls in the, in the basically neck of the members of the UN. Like, for example, if US doesn't want to do something, or Russia doesn't want to do something, or China doesn't want to do something, or France or UK do not want to do something, and these are permanent members, is that right? They could paralyze Security Council, and then we say, oh wow, Security Council didn't accomplish its goal. I wonder why. Is that right? Because they can veto. Here we go. Like, for example, how did UN right now in the last 2 years, since February 24th of 2020, when Russia has invaded Ukraine, is that right? How has UN been trying to do something? Russia has the veto power, and with its allies and everything, it just makes sure that there's going to be no major, things going against it. So what has happened is the countries that are trying to help Ukraine outside that structure, they're giving it weapons, they're getting this, they're trying to at least get some, resolution going on, and if it's not in Security Council, at least in General Assembly, to try either, first of all, claim who is the aggressor, and then try to provide a chance for peace and negotiations and everything. In that regard, Security Council, has done its best, and Secretary General has been doing its best. And if you recall, there was a whole issue about, when the Black Sea is basically blocked, and all that grain, all that food that both Russia and Ukraine, especially Ukraine, is producing, it was going to Africa. So African countries had nothing to do with it. Why should they starve to death because, Russia and Ukraine are in the middle of a war, etc.? See what I mean? So things are connected to each other. That's what you should remember. So there are some, as we mentioned, some of these deficiencies exist, but despite all these criticism, I should mention that still UN has come to play a very significant role. I know this has been a little bit longer lecture than usual. Is that right? Because the topic was very, very wide, and I had to provide you with even highlights of material and give you some general ideas, and we had 20 slides to cover. Is that right? But we did it. So please review the material. If you still have a question, feel free to send me an email. Ask me a question. Thank you so much. I hope you learned something.